Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 5 of Adelaide Conservatives. Today, we have a very special guest for our 5th episode. John Elferink is the former Attorney General and Minister of Corrections of the Northern Territory. I think Casuarina was a high school you graduated for back in the day.
Casuarina High School, a good public school, a bit on the wild side, but as the Northern Territory is from time to time, you learn to fight and you learn to survive in the public school system.
The one area of Darwin everyone knows is Casuarina, the Bay shopping centre.
That's for sure.
But I suppose after high school, you went on and had a career in the Northern Territory Police Force in Darwin and in Alice Springs.
Well, pretty much across the length and the breadth of the Northern Territory for different reasons, but actual postings were in Darwin and in Alice Springs, working in various sections, including towards the end of my career as a detective in the Alice Springs Police CIB.
Nice. And you sort of were a detective, I think, sergeant. You had a few roles there within the police force. But then politics came a knocking, and you ran for a seat that I actually looked this up today. I think it was at McDonald was a 16.8% swing needed. That's a pretty ambitious young man that puts his hand up for pre-selection in a seat like that.
Yeah, I was more or less press ganged into it. I'm one of those political accidents rather than somebody who determined to follow political ambitions in their life. So to cut a long story short is that I was sitting in the police station one day and the commander, Pappy Bullock, stuck his head around the corner and said, "What have you been doing, Elferink?" And I said, "What do you mean, sir?" Thinking I was in trouble, as I usually was for various reasons. And he said, "I don't know what you've been up to, but the Chief Minister wants to see you." Well, I was a member of the Our Country Liberal Party by that stage, and had already just achieved my first degree in political science. And so I went and saw the Chief Minister, and sitting there was the party president and the Chief Minister, and basically they said, "Look, we need a face for a poster." And I knew the people of the electorate they were talking about. So the electorate they were talking about was the electorate of McDonald, which was an area of slightly larger than Victoria tacked onto the bottom of the Northern Territory, which was about 80% traditional Aboriginal in terms of the population. I was reasonably well known amongst those voters. I'd arrested many of them and had other relationships with others. That never, by the way, precluded you from being voted for. If you were decent or dealt with people decently, then generally speaking, whether you'd arrested them or not would not affect their opinion of you in any profound fashion. As a consequence, I said, all right, well, I'll have a crack. However, I require the following things, and to the party's credit, they provided me with those things, and the seat ended up swinging, if memory serves me, about 18%, and I held it by 1%. Fate conspired to assist me to a degree, because the Rustabon Labor member, Neil Bell, who occupied that seat prior to that election, got the shits on with the ALP at that stage and resigned, creating a vacancy shortly after my pre-selection. And as a consequence of that, it opened up the field substantially, and I got support from many Aboriginal voters.
So you've come in with this mammoth feat, 16.8% you need, and you end up with a 8.2. I mean, I remember reading about this. I think not only the Labor Party did what they do constantly, and is in a safe seat, they get a little bit cocky, and they pre-selected a union heavyweight who sort of alienated the local community. And I suppose as a Conservative, a lot of the support came from the Indigenous community, which was absolutely phenomenal to see throughout that area. And it, as you said before, it comes to the experiences you had with the community first.
So there's this deep-seated presumption that Aboriginal people are there's a deep-seated presumption that Aboriginal people are inherently left-leaning, and I've never really been able to reconcile that with many of the people I've met. Many of the attitudes that I met with traditional Aboriginal people are very much in the nature of a conservative worldview, particularly those older people who had certain standards and beliefs, often deeply espoused Christian beliefs, which lent themselves to conservative thinking. The Labor Party has been able to entrench itself in a lot of these remote regional areas because the sorts of people that are prepared to go and work in these remote regional areas are often people who come from this desire to save the world and save the universe.
Yeah.
And so that they end up being in those positions of teachers and doctors and nurses and those sorts of things. That's not to say they're all conservative, but they're all left-wing left-leaning. So they have that sort of influence. And then, of course, you have the land councils who are also ensconced with lots of people who try to peddle that sort of worldview.
Yeah.
But the Aboriginal people themselves, or the traditional people, particularly the older men and women, I wouldn't say that they were automatically left-leaning. A lot of what they support that they provide is based on trust. And if you've developed a reputation of being trustworthy, that's worth a lot more than necessarily a political worldview. What I never ran into was Aboriginal people sitting in their communities talking about the role of the military-industrial complex and how the bourgeoisie were affecting the right of the proletariat to exert economic rights through the Marxist lens. And the reason that was the case is because that's not how they see the world. It's not an issue.
No, and you're dead right there. I know just from Indigenous people that I know, when you talk to them about things like what you're talking about, and then leading into that, you talk to them about the voice and that sort of stuff. It's not that they don't share the same worldview as Albanese and left leaning people.
As you're alluding to that, I think the fundamental problem with that is the assumption that all Aboriginal people have to have the same political view or stance is completely wrong. No race, human group in the world has consensus on political views.
That's completely patronising. There's 400 plus nations, and if you listen to the ALP at the moment, they try and tell you that they all want the same things and all believe the same things. And I mean that's like, as an Aboriginal person, I would be completely blown away by that. It's completely patronising.
And it goes back down to sort of what we started off with, is it comes back down to the local area and the local community and knowing your local things and the issues that come upon there. That's where you're going to make the biggest difference in all types of politics, not just Indigenous politics.
Yeah.
Here's the deal, is that perhaps to put in context what you're talking about,
yeah,
you may recall about the year 2000, 250,000 people walked across the Sydney Harbour Bridge to say that they were sorry about the stolen generation. And that was well-intentioned, and I'm not necessarily down on that, as I think that the people who are supporting the voice are well-intentioned. I may not agree with them, but my starting position is that a person's primary worldview is generally decent until they prove otherwise through their conduct or statements.
You're more generous than me on that.
But the day after that bridge walk happened, I was stopped in Hermannsburg, in Daria as it's called nowadays, which is about 130 k's west of Alice Springs, by Lofty Everteringa. And Lofty asked me, he'd seen it on TV the night before, and he said, "What's all that about?" So I sat down and spent about 20 minutes explaining the motivations and what was going on. And he said to me, and I'm going to paraphrase him slightly because there's a rude word which I won't repeat here.
Yeah, sure.
But he said to me, "I have no problem with you white fellas. It's those Walbury bastards I hate." He didn't say bastards, but the other word.
Yeah.
And I laughed and I thought, okay, that's mildly amusing. But then I thought about it, and it occurred to me afterwards that, of course, he doesn't see Aboriginal people. He sees Walbury, Luricha, Pintabee, Yankunytjatjara, Nungaratjara, Pitjantjatjara, Jingli, Tiwi, Anawa, all of those different language groups. In the same way, there is no such thing as a white fella in Europe. There are Germans, there are Dutch, there are Liechtensteinians, there are French, there are Hungarians, Czechs, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And the consequence is that you and I, when we go to Europe, see a kaleidoscope of different cultures and languages and thoughts and systems and belief systems. For an Aboriginal person, they are, particularly from a traditional background, they are confronted with exactly that kaleidoscope.
Yeah.
And so what happens is that he sees these different groups, language groups, cultural groups with their different attitudes through exactly the same lens that a white person sees Europe.
Yeah.
And you now know that the best you could ever hope for is a loose conglomeration of opinions to form some sort of Aboriginal/First Nations worldview. Inside that worldview, that there are so many different opinions. It's barely a useful tool by which you can say this is the attitude of those people.
Yeah, well, I mean, we see that here in Adelaide. You know, like a few of the Ghana people that I know, like they have lots of disputes and lots of differences of view with Narungga people and Narrandjeri people. Like they're not on the same page with a lot of things.
Even within Ghana, I certainly know that on my time as Mayor and Deputy Mayor at the City of Onkaparinga, working with the Ghana First Nations People Advisory Group that we had set up to talk about local issues, there is different groups within even Ghana itself. So you had what they would call as the forest people, the top of the hill. You had the Ghana people of the plains. They had difference in languages even within Ghana. And you talk about one of 148, 149 nations around Australia. There's no consensus within one group because they are individual groups and clans within.
Yeah. Here's an absurd proposition for you, that different people, simply by virtue of the race, are suddenly reduced to some sort of science fiction version or science fact version of the Borg from Star Trek.
That's a good point.
So, race, and assuming that within a race there is a proclivity to a certain political worldview, I think is unwise. And if you use that template, then let's look at the federal parliament, which has about, I think, 10 people who now identify as being Aboriginal.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, if you want to run this absurd argument about representation,
overrepresented,
means that they're about 1% overrepresented.
Yeah.
If the overall population of Australia is 3% Aboriginal, then that's 4 and a bit % of the parliament.
Yeah.
Those 10 individuals. It's a dumb argument because those 10 individuals sit in the Labor Party, the Liberal Party, as well as the Country Liberal Party, and in other.
Had Greens that went independent.
That's the one I was trying to think of.
Yeah.
And I was say the lunatic fringe in her case.
Yeah.
In my personal opinion, in relation to her, is that she drapes Aboriginality in front of herself as a license to behave reprehensibly.
Yeah, it's a cover. It's a cover to do whatever she likes.
The motives, I think, are shallow, and the behaviour is even worse.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's great. That's as much time as I'll give to her.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point, I think. So you then had to front up after this first election where you had this swing no one thought, and then the world of electoral boundaries changes on you, and in, I think, the 2001 election, the seat becomes notionally Labor again after redistribution, and again you're back in the trenches up for another fight. I think that election, there was a swing, a big swing towards the Labor Party. You're at a seat that's now notionally Labor. You hold on. How does that go down?
Well, I win it with an absolute majority because, getting back to what I was saying before, all politics is local. By the time that I got to that second election, I knew a lot of these people on a much more intimate level, and I made absolutely sure that I was directly involved in many elements of their lives. So one of the things I used to do was go through all of the government contracts which were issued through the normal tender process and then advertised in the Government Gazette as being complete or being issued. And then I would go out and have a barbecue. So if a stretch of road received some bitumen, for argument's sake, we'd have a barbecue. We'd put a red tape across the road. A couple of school kids would cut the tape, and then the people would know that was government expenditure spent on their community. If it was an air conditioning system or a new powerhouse or even a sewerage system, there was always that effort to try and remind people that this was a service that was being delivered, and I was involved in that process in as much as that I made sure that the tender processes were properly followed and that the contracts were properly rolled out by the contractors who went into these remote areas and delivered these services. Involving yourself in that level means that you are seen as a community leader and back to square one. All politics is local.
And the thing that I think is a really good learning point, I think even the South Australian Liberals could take a page out of this book, is at no stage during this time, for anything that I can see, did you ever shy away from your core political sense of you're a conservative, your values. They did not change.
No, not at all.
You did not shy away from that.
My maiden speech was a clear and unambiguous articulation of my beliefs and criticisms of the left, as well as a profound criticism, particularly of the Land Rights Act and how it was being rolled out in the Northern Territory. That is not to say that I'm anti-land rights. I don't have an issue with land rights. I'm a great supporter. As a landowner, I'm a great supporter of land rights. But what I'm concerned about is that the Land Rights Act, and that was now 20 years ago when I made that maiden speech, in fact, more than 20 years ago, the Land Rights Act has now been operational for 50 years in the Northern Territory, which has handed about 1/12 of Australia's land mass, so about 8% of Australia's land is owned by the owners of this land, and that land continually or continues to fail to support those people.
It doesn't make any sense, does it?
Prior to the arrival of Europeans, those people who walked upon that land and had connection with that land sustained themselves of that land. And the only thing that I would suggest, and I'm not suggesting for a second that you go back to those traditional systems, but the principle has to be the same. If the land could sustain them before the arrival of Europeans, then the land should be able to continue to sustain them after the arrival of Europeans as part of...
Well, that's just common sense, isn't it? You think that's how it would work.
Well, they're essentially some of Australia's largest landowners, and they are dirt poor, and rich dirt poor.
Yeah.
And it's an incredible failure of the ambitions of the Land Rights Act, which was lofty in its intent, but because it creates so many walls of protection, with the passage of time, those walls of protection have become their prison.
Yeah.
So post your political career, you've moved down here to South Australia. We're now in a state now as an observer of politics. You can see the entire mainland Australia turn away from the Liberal Party, now sitting with the Labor Party, although when you look at primary votes, you could argue that very differently. But it's an interesting state of affairs in this country. What went so wrong, in your opinion, as someone on the outside now looking in?
Oh, look, there was loss of trust. So, look, let's start off with the first observation. These things come and go. There was a time when Campbell Newman, as the Lord Mayor of Brisbane, was the most senior Liberal in government.
Yeah.
And that was only 25 years ago. And then we saw this massive swing back to conservative politics, and with the passage of time, it's now drifted back towards to the left, and that's the nature of a country, any country.
So do you think it's just a cyclic thing? You don't think it's anything to do with perhaps the Liberal Party moving away from its core conservative base at all?
My issue is that it's an integrity thing. What lost Labor? So let's look at the Howard years.
Yeah.
Howard remained Prime Minister for a decade and plus a bit. And basically, whether you liked Howard or not, he projected a certain level of integrity. Ultimately got to the stage where you have this "it's time" factor. That's why the Liberals lost in the early 70s against Whitlam, was because it was literally "it's time." That was their slogan. So there's an element of the "it's time" factor, but Howard was returned for a number of elections on the basis that I think that he had integrity. The Labor Party, so you had the Kevin 07 effect, and then there was Gillard, and then there was Kevin again. That cost them their integrity, which is ultimately what cost them the election. I think the difficulty for Scott Morrison was that he didn't come across as being trustworthy. There was, I think, and perhaps with some truth, an element of healthy skepticism in relation to his motives. The whole thing was just a little bit too polished and a little bit too manufactured to really give a sense of a genuine personality.
So you don't think, well, that's obviously a factor, but you don't think the fact that he from a guy walking into the chamber with a lump of coal a few years earlier to a guy that was going to Glasgow and signing up for all these agreements, well, I suppose that comes back to integrity, I guess what you're saying. I suppose he had sort of, people thought that's what it was about.
Indeed, is it the 2019 federal election where no one thought he was going to win, and he won that election because he stayed true to his conservative values, and And it doesn't matter if you're conservative values or not. Any political leader, you've got to stay true to your values.
Well, that's who we thought he was.
Yeah, and I think to an extent, it probably is who he was. And it happens to a lot of people. They get into the office, the pressure of governing, and they go wish-washy with advisors around them telling them left, right and centre, rather than going, okay, thanks for the advice, this is my...
Or poll watching as well.
Yeah.
That can come into it too.
Look, in Morrison in 2019 against Shorten, I think, is the one that you're referring to.
Yeah.
I think that Morrison at that stage still was plausible in many people's eyes, but there was the added complication that had Shorten was signalling that people's superannuation was going to become a legitimate target. And he did that in an almost Hughesonestic fashion where he suggested a new tax from opposition. You may recall Keating standing there saying this is the sweetest victory of all, and that was a victory handed to Keating by Hewson by trying to run a very sensible argument about the requirement for a GST, but doing it from opposition. Howard, of course, did it from government and was able to lay the groundwork for that idea over a number of months, 18 months.
Yeah, and I suppose after the 1996 election too, he had a pretty decent margin to work with too in leading up to introducing that tax. So he had a buffer to be able to sell it to the Australian people, and not everyone was going to buy it, but enough people were going to buy it based on his margin to keep him in power.
So Shorten, I think, contributed to that loss because if there was any uncertainty about Morrison, there was no uncertainty about Shorten, as far as particularly people who are self-funded retirees and those sorts of things were concerned. So the jury was out on Morrison. The jury was definitely in on Shorten, and they had delivered a guilty verdict. The next time round, of course, Morrison is accumulating what all governments accumulate, which is damage. So no matter how, the longer you're in government, you start to accumulate all of those bits of damage that eventually will get you to lose government. And that's eventually where Morrison got to. But Morrison also couldn't take a trick. There was a number of these issues that cropped up. And I've got the sensation that in some respects, the conservative flavour started to take on almost in the public's imagination this American conservative flavour, which is not necessarily an Australian attribute. Even conservative Australia has this fair go principle woven into its thinking.
Yeah. And look, as you said, every government takes on damage, and by then Morrison had taken on Morrison's damage, but he also took on Turnbull's damage and Abbott's damage. It was a long-term Conservative government sitting in there for the Liberal Party. But I think the message there for all Conservatives is to remember is that this government now they're going to stuff up. They're going to be emboldened. They've got majorities. They can get things through the Senate relatively easily. They're going to make policies in place that will be so against what a Conservative value will be, is that they'll bring opportunities to Conservative leaders to actually stand up and show strong leadership to say, no, this is not what my community stands for, and we're going to stand up against this.
But that's as long as Conservative leaders do that. Like my biggest fear is that they'll do a little bit what I think Scott Morrison did. They'll basically follow the trend, and the trend at the time leading into the last election was about environmentalism and just about a few things that just weren't core values for most Conservatives. And I just wonder whether, we have to stick to those core values, even if it means losing. Stick to our core values and our core messaging going into the next election, rather than just trying to be anyone that's not Anthony Albanese.
Look, Anthony Albanese is still got a lot of shine, and he's had probably the longest honeymoon period I've seen of any Prime Minister.
Yeah, it's going for a bit.
But he's not going to be able to avoid the invariably difficult decisions of government that he's going to have to make. And when that happens, that's when the true mettle will be tested. And now at the moment, they have a number of issues which they're just kicking the can down the road and saying, well, we'll deal with that later. And the core issue that they're running with is, in my opinion, a peripheral issue, which is the voice.
Yeah.
Which is a distraction. And of course, it's a useful political tool because it sort of wedges the Conservatives and the Liberals and the Conservatives from each other. And of course, it's a unifying feel-good idea for which Labor people will so stridently adhere to. And I understand the motives. I just think that functionally and for the outcome of Australia, if it gets up, the consequence of it will be as meaningless as ATSIC was when ATSIC was operations.
Yeah. So you're
And the difference is, when you embed something like this in the Constitution, you're stuck with it.
Well, let's have a look at what we're actually being asked to vote for. So you've got ATSIC as your benchmark. ATSIC was governance by Aboriginal people, of Aboriginal people, for Aboriginal people. So it was almost like a parallel parliament. So you identified as Aboriginal, so you got yourself onto the role, and you then were able to elect ATSIC commissioners. Those commissioners came together in a form of cabinet/parliament in its own right, and then they had direct input into government expenditure. They had budgets, and money was going to be spent accordingly. It was so unsuccessful that eventually it got to the point that when Howard sought to roll it up, it was endorsed for its removal by both. It was a unilaterally or bilaterally supported legislative change to get rid of ATSIC. So now we're going to get the Voice. The Voice isn't actually not going to run budgets. It's not going to do anything directly for Aboriginal people. It's going to sit on the periphery, and it's going to say you've got to do this and you've got to do that, both at a parliamentary and an executive, both parliamentary and executive, as well as at the level of government services.
Yeah.
But it won't actually have to do anything. So its accountabilities are what?
Yeah, see, like I said earlier, you're much more generous than me as far as you're talking about motives. I actually really believe, as I've said before, I believe the motive is to create this outside of Parliament body, which any Conservative government or Liberal government going forward that gets in, it'll be there to say, we think you should do this. And when they don't, the Labor Party will be able to use it for an eternity as a whacking tool against a Liberal or
it's one of the biggest
government.
Concerns I've heard from Indigenous people I've spoken to in the community is that they're scared, one, that their culture is going to be politicised. Two, they're scared that it's going to take the culture authority away from the cultural custodians and go to an electoral system where in Ghana, people from Brisbane can come down. If they live here, they'll vote here. So the people who are the traditional owners will take their rights away from them.
About them being elected. They're talking about them being selected. And I'm thinking there's a big difference between someone like, we're a democracy. They're talking about the people that are going to represent this voice as being selected people. So that's outside of the democracy that we live in. And that's not really kosher for me.
It's tricky, but I think getting back to your point, John, is okay. Let's take all of this stuff from the outside away. What is the objectives? How do we sit back and just say, if you're setting up the KPIs for this new voice, what are they trying to gain as it?
It's an opinion.
I listened very carefully to Noel Pearson, who made the best case for it, in my opinion. He said, look, it's not about race, it's about the continuum of the original inhabitants of this country. And so his argument is that don't focus on the race component. It's about acknowledging the pre settlement of this country by other people, and that they have a continuing voice in how that should occur. Now, I'm gratified to hear at least one person out there on the other side of the debate is saying it's not about race, because it shouldn't be about race, but invariably it's an unavoidable part of the debate. But my take on that, of course, is that they are now included in what exists now. And we know that because the people who identify as Aboriginal and have those roots in that direction, are now represented in a parliamentary democracy. This is some sort of extra thing that is expected to improve outcomes, KPIs. There won't be a KPI. It'll be just criticism. It's a little bit like, children's commissioners and summer and health complaints commissioners and those sorts of roles. These are now offices that are established, and their sole function is to look at the functions of government and then write reports and criticise those functions of government. I think that the Labor Party will get smacked around the head just as well. No, probably not as much as Conservative forces. But the issue I've got with it is that as a voice, it will become an exercise in the Aboriginal intelligentsia, being very loud in the front bar of the Hilton Hotel in Canberra, whilst the children that live in Nirripee and Yuendamu and Papunya will not hear that voice, or if they hear it, it will be such a distant whisper in a language that they don't understand that it will be nothing more than a fluctuation on a breeze, and it will mean nothing to them.
So that's the thing. I would support it if I thought it would help those children you're talking about. But I think you're dead right. They're not going to have any voice in this. It's going to be a bunch of elites, like you said, sitting in Canberra. It's not going to be the
people that get
couple
on
of people that really need the help.
Will be the people in the community who already have a strong voice, who already have the means and the capability to be heard at the highest levels of government. They're the ones that will comprise of this voice. But you're right, the people on country in the remote communities that are living that lived experience, that term that they always love to use, they're the ones who'll be left completely out of this. And again, what will be the outcomes for those communities? And that's not been solved by anyone on the Yes campaign.
Has Marcia Langdon ever been silenced? Or Charles Perkins? Or Noel Pearson? Have any of these people ever been actively silenced from articulating their opinions? Absolutely not.
No.
In fact, they get microphones pointed at them every time.
They're given a platform every time they want to speak. Yeah.
So I would argue that there is a number of vehicles available to which an Aboriginal voice, and I say that in quotation marks, already exists. Formalising it in the Constitution does what exactly? So eventually it becomes an institution, whatever shape it takes.
It means you can't get rid of it, basically.
And its sole function will ultimately be to point out everything that government isn't doing. Now, how do you measure that? Okay, KPIs. The most common political KPI on Aboriginal outcomes by government is we are spending X number of dollars. Yeah. So we have this issue over here, and the next press release from whatever the minister is we are now expending X number of dollars on that issue. The consequence of that is you then have a productivity commission review into expenditure on Aboriginal issues in Australia, which is now about $30 billion a year.
Jeez.
Now, put that into context. The Northern Territory's budget, in terms of all of its income sources, is about $8 billion.
Yeah.
So you have a substantial overspend on Aboriginal issues. Now, that's great. If we're trying to fix up social problems, we're spending lots of money. Now let's go to Yuendamu and see how those social problems are going. Nope. We are still seeing child abuse rates as high as they ever have been. And in the process of doing all of this, by the way, we're seeing domestic violence rates, we're seeing crime rates skyrocket, et cetera, in the process of delivering all of these services. The one thing that we're not doing is placing on the shoulders of the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of this expenditure the responsibility that comes with being a responsible human being. Imagine you lived in a world in which you were told you had lots of options, but no matter what you chose, the result would be chosen for you.
Yeah.
There is nothing so fundamentally disempowering as the mendicancy which automatically flows from being attached to the government nipple. The worst thing that we can continue doing for people that live in these remote and regional areas is absolving them from the responsibility of being decent parents and good citizens. Medicalising their behaviour so that we now determine that their deviant behaviour, when deviant behaviour occurs, is the product of some medical shortcoming, which has evolved from some sort of, what's the quote I heard you constantly hear, intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
They don't have an exclusive hold on trauma. Everybody has trauma in their lives to a greater, the only question is what's the greater or lesser extent. So you've got to a place where we have made this assertion that nobody is responsible for anything. and therefore people believe it. So they've abandoned their responsibilities as parents. They've abandoned their responsibilities to their own communities. Thomas Hobbes observed in the Leviathan, life without law would be nasty, brutish and short. Well, you've got many Aboriginal people in these remote and regional areas who do not adhere to their traditional systems of law, have zero regard for European law, and I would describe their lives exactly in those terms: nasty, brutish and short.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you see that right now going on in Alice Springs. I mean, in your time as Attorney General, you were often criticised about the fact that you enforced the law up there, and now you see what's going on now. What do you make of all of that?
Government has this unpleasant role of occasionally having to keep a lid on things, and to do that, you have to exert the force which government adopts. So we, as Attorney General and as the Minister for Corrections and a number of other ministerial portfolios I held, I sought to make sure that the systems that we had in place were systems aimed at containment. But all that you can do as a minister at that point is use your tools for containment, as eventually it's up to the citizenry to pick up the responsibility and say, well, we're going to adjust ourselves. But in that process, of course, you have to run prisons, and police have to arrest people, and courts have to jail people or fine people, as the case may be.
Yeah, well, I guess you look at it. I mean, there's lots of other moving parts to the whole Alice Springs thing. I mean, like the removal of the cashless debit card, the dry zone laws, all that sort of stuff changing up there. I mean, it's just a perfect storm, isn't it, really, what's happening there now?
Well, at the moment, of course, is what's happening now is that the signal has gone out to many of these kids that roam the streets that you are now not responsible. Yeah, not responsible for your behaviour. Their parents are often disengaged with their own children, and they are consistently being told is that you are traumatised and you're the victim of trauma, and therefore you have licence to behave as you will. And that's fine if it happens in a vacuum, but it's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in a community in which the victims are invariably the good burghers of Alice Springs. And it's not just Alice Springs, in Darwin as well. There are a number of matters which are before the courts now where you're seeing an escalating seriousness of crimes being perpetrated. And I'm not going to speak about matters that are currently subject to court processes, but in recent times there have been 2 homicides, and it's up to the courts to determine the guilt or innocence or otherwise. But those homicides have been very high profile, and they've been in Darwin. So this behavioural footprint is starting to spread.
Yeah. No, it's. I mean, what would you do if you had the opportunity to, like, say you're Attorney General now? I mean, what would you do to turn the whole thing around?
Oh, look, the first thing I'd say is that you need to have more than just even the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory isn't capable of doing this, because you're dealing with 2 elements. You've got the Commonwealth Government, which on a fortnightly basis drops millions and millions of dollars into the Northern Territory with various forms of welfare payments. That then initiates certain behaviours, expenditure on grog and those sorts of things. You then have the Territory Government, who then has to spend millions and millions of dollars every fortnight cleaning up the mess from that original expenditure. When I was the Attorney General and the Health Minister in the Northern Territory, I made multiple attempts to reach out to the Commonwealth Government at the time, which you would have hoped would have been sympathetic because it was a Conservative government, to say we have to reconcile those 2 forms of expenditure so that we're not wasting money spending money on creating a problem, which we then spend money on fixing. And until that issue is reconciled, you're going to continue having these sorts of problems.
Yeah. In general, with policing, what are your thoughts on how we go about policing now? And I know it's something that you're really passionate about, having been an ex-police officer. What can you tell us about, like, the direction as far as policing is concerned?
Oh, look, policing is always going to be a challenge. You've got to remember that policing is nothing ever other than an immediate response to an issue that you have in civil society. The first observation I'd care to make is that the vast majority of society will go about its business never having contact with the police under any circumstances. The worst that will happen to most people is they'll get a speeding ticket. That will be their contact with the police. You then have an element of society which regularly and repeatedly has contact with the police, and what the police do is that they are, if you like, the cleaning agency that cleans up the mess on a daily basis. People sort of look to the police to be the solution for endemic crime problems. No, all they can ever be is a response to particular behaviour. If you're going to set up your police to try and prevent crimes from happening, then the levels of intrusion that you would create in a society of that nature would be a totalitarian regime. But we naturally restrain the police to a particular function in a free society, and for good reason. So the police will be nothing more than a response. That then means that the police will bring people to the courts will do what they can, and of course there's a number of ways that courts can divert people away from the criminal justice system, particularly if they're younger, but alternatively they can also divert them into the custodial environment as a form of punishment. But the truth of the matter is that you can have a well-funded police force, a great court system, and a great system of corrections. Ultimately, you're still stuck with this idea that a society is only as good as the standards that it sets for itself. And that's the real challenge. Now, one of my great criticisms of the left has always been that they're prepared to make excuses for
bad behaviour.
For bad behaviour, and try and create a reason as to why that bad behaviour is occurring. That might even be true, but I don't automatically subscribe to the notion that that absolves a person of their responsibility for their actions. If it were true, based on my own childhood and experiences of my own childhood, I should be a drug-addled moron sitting in doing a life sentence by now. But that didn't happen. It turns out I'm actually I ended up being the Attorney General. I'm a barrister at law. I lecture in universities on labour economics. So the pathway that if trauma is supposed to be the yardstick of that pathway, then I stand as a example as to why that's just simply not true.
Yeah, no, you did right. There are plenty of people that didn't necessarily have a fantastic upbringing, but that they're not all destitute and struggling in life.
And the easiest thing to do is blame, excuses, denial. They're the three easiest things that anyone can do to avoid personal responsibility. And I think in the political sphere, that is what is forgotten the most, is personal responsibility.
Yeah.
As a man, I've got a personal responsibility as a husband. As a father, I've got responsibility to make sure that I'm going out working, for setting a good example for my family, keeping them healthy, roof over the head. These responsibilities are fundamental, that should be so far outside of government that as a community, what do we hold responsible? First and foremost, should be yourself. Your personal responsibilities are number one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, just to paint a picture, so I'm not talking through my hat, grew up in an alcoholic home, had my own issues with drug and alcohol problems when I was younger, sexually abused as a child. The fellow that abused me in the most intrusive ways as you can possibly imagine. The most reprehensible part of his conduct towards me was that he took me to what was called a beat, where he shared the wealth with other, and I was 13 at the time.
Wow.
And it was pretty ghastly. And yes, it had a profound effect. I went off the rails, and I got into some housebreaking, and I got arrested by the police. But at some point in my life, I came to the conclusion that pathway wasn't a reasonable pathway to take. Now, was it my fault? No. Am I embarrassed by it? No. Am I proud of it? No. It's just what it is. It's just how life goes. So on the basis of those personal experiences, I should be in a jail according to the left, and rather than making that my identity, I make it part of my experience. But my identity is somebody who says, I'm a responsible citizen, I'm a responsible adult, I'm a responsible husband, as you've just said, I'm a responsible father, and I think about my duties towards my employers, the people that pay my bills, and my responsibilities come at the same standard and strength as my rights. And so that they are balanced. I expect to be able to speak freely in a free country. And the only reason I talk about this is to demonstrate that not everybody's life is as squeaky clean as it may appear at first blush. But those people who have overcome trauma in their lives, whatever that trauma may be, go on to live better lives. If we constantly focus on a person's trauma, the only thing they're going to ultimately realise is that they've been traumatised.
Yeah, you're reinforcing it.
Yeah. We're saying that, but here's the thing. Try and move out of that space and form an opinion which is contrary to the left's worldview in relation to this sort of thing, and they will absolutely criticise you for not being as feeling and as caring as they are, particularly when it comes to dealing with the adult survivors of child sexual abuse. So if I sit there and say, look, I'm responsible for my emotions and reactions today. It's bloody nearly 50 years since just nearly 50 years since this happened to me. I don't have a right anymore to say it's not my responsibility. Somewhere along that pathway, it became my duty to fix that. So I didn't. The guy went to jail for his crimes. I continue to be a successful member of the community, and I assist and occasionally assist the victims of child sexual crimes today to sue their perpetrators.
Well, I mean, thanks for sharing that with us. I didn't know that about yourself, but that's, and I really appreciate it.
I think it's another great example, though. Like, you've always been really open up front with your past and your history, and the left will always talk about lived experience, but they only want to listen to the lived experience that fits their narrative.
That's right.
So the fact that a conservative leader could be out there and have a trauma background, we need to cast them to the side and put all sort of dispersions to them. I think at one stage you came out in the media and spoke about the fact you, as a police officer, you rocked up to work drunk.
Yep.
Now that was an honest thing. That's what
That's right.
What's one criticism of politicians at the moment? The politicians aren't honest. You come out and you make a completely blunt and honest statement, and they try and crucify you for that.
Yeah, they did. They went after me a big time because I had said to the Parliament at one stage is that I had these issues, and we were talking about a matter was relevant to this sort of thing. And I said, look, I've had my own drug and alcohol problem, and it's been many, many years since I've drunk alcohol. But I admitted to that, and they went ballistic. There was this desire to drag me down because you aren't allowed to have lived experience and then do something about it. You've just got to have the lived experience and wallow in that place so that you can then be rescued without ever actually having the intention of rescuing you.
Mm-hmm.
They just want it. It then becomes, and if you understand the psychology of that, it's more about the carer in their mind's eye than the cared for.
Yeah.
If you want to get a result where people live a really good and healthy and happy life if they've been traumatized, then when they succeed, you should applaud. But no, that's often not the case.
Yeah, it's the opposite. It's literally, I'm going to put, you're sharing a vulnerable moment, I'm going to put my foot on your head and bob you under. It is the opposite of what the empowerment should be. And, we're talking about responsibilities. The other half of responsibilities comes from your rights. So people have rights and they have responsibilities. You don't get your responsibilities without having, you don't get rights without having responsibilities. And your rights can never trump other people's rights. Humans have all sorts of rights that we need to respect. But the responsibility means that I can't use my rights to trump your rights or your rights. We have to go collectively together. And that's where the left really push these things. And it's not just, we look at your story, but to bring into the modern times now, we have a look, and we spoke about this last week with Ben Hood on the podcast, that as soon as Peter Dutton announced Senator Little, and Senator Cinda Price on the shadow cabinet, all of a sudden these are the Aboriginal voices that we shouldn't listen to, and they started attacking. The left media attacked shocking people like Karen Little, Senator Price, on the fact that they are sellouts to their community and they're just singing the conservative words because it's good for them politically. Well, you can't choose, again, which political voices you want to listen to. If you want an Aboriginal voice, you have to listen to all Aboriginal voices.
The danger with the whole thing is, yes, they can choose what voices they want to listen to because they're, as I said earlier, they're selected, they're not elected. So that's my biggest fear with it is who are you going to get in this voice?
You've got to remember, of course, that I've known Jacinta for many years, and I know her mum Bess particularly well, because Jacinta and Bess both come from Yuendamu, and they are Walpuri speakers. If the yardstick of legitimacy for the voice is the fact that you can speak perhaps your traditional language, then there are few who would be more legitimate than Jacinta Price. But she expounds a lot of those conservative values that she has absorbed and understood from her elders.
Yeah.
When I started talking here today, I talked about the natural conservatism, particularly in older Aboriginal people, and that's often a moral Christian-based conservatism. And I see that reflected in the articulations of Jacinta Price, not necessarily the Christian component, but the moral component. And of course, she understands and sees when she goes to Yuendamu, where her family lives, she sees the end product of all of this expenditure to rescue Aboriginal people, and she sees how fundamentally corrosive it is. You've created a whole class of beggars, and the solution to every problem now, and we've convinced many of the people that live in these remote areas, is that government's going to fix it.
Yeah.
And my attitude has always been that if you're looking to government to fix your problems, then you have got some really serious problems. Government makes an absolutely awful parent, but it's government. You listen to the arguments out there. Government's the one that's got to fix the child protection crisis.
Yeah.
By the time that government is allowed to get involved, and it is properly restrained in the child protection environment, it's because the calamity that's visited that family is so profound that there is no rescuing that child for anything other than actual harm.
Yeah.
So we're expecting government to fill the moral void, whatever that looks like. Government is going to rescue me from my health issues. Government is going to rescue me from my educational issues. I have no role in any of this. I don't have to pay attention to my education. And that's one of the things that we see in these remote and regional areas, is parents are completely disengaged with the education system. But that's all right, because government will fix that. When my kids get old enough, they will receive whatever I'm receiving at the moment, so we don't have to be at all ambitious for my children. And this idea that government fixes everything is fundamentally flawed, and it is a fraud. It is an outright fraud.
Well, it's basically Marxism, isn't it? Like, I think that's what the left wants. The left wants everyone to be dependent on government.
The left is a victim of its own fraudulent belief. They believe their own fraud, and they actually believe that if you throw money at a problem and get some public servants to deliver the services, that the magical outcome will happen. That is not how the human being works. It's not how the society works. And the ultimate manifestation of having an income, which is in no way related to effort, is seen in remote and regional places in Australia, but we've seen it in other places, like the aristocracy in England, at the end of the British Empire. There were many of those people who were completely had a dislocation between their income and their and their work, and they were bizarre. Some of the most lunatic people in the history of the world were rich people who had put no effort into their income and no connection with the real world. We're manifesting that in remote and regional areas through an artifice which is called help, and people actually believe that if they make this magical effort on behalf of a third party, that third party will somehow blossom independently. If dignity could be delivered to these remote communities, we'd be doing it with 5 kilogram packets to every household. But that's not how dignity works. Yeah.
I would challenge anyone to point to a situation in any government's tenure around the world where creating larger governments with more bureaucracy to throw money at issues has actually led to a sustainable solution. I can't think of too many around the world that's ever happened.
Well, the presumption with all government programs is eventually that they will succeed, and therefore everybody can pack up their suitcases and go home. But of course, you and I know that bureaucracies are not designed to be successful in that sense, so they perpetuate themselves.
Yeah.
One of the things that we always like to promote on this podcast, John, is conservative-minded people, particularly in Adelaide that it seems like we are completely outnumbered at the moment running for office, whether it be running for your local council, state or federal government. We need good-minded Conservative people to put their hands up. And your story is certainly one that people can look at and say, well, you know what, you could have said, no, I don't want to be a kicking boy and just put a couple of cornflakes up. Well, that led to a political career that has served you well. What would you say to young Conservatives out there at the moment that might be thinking about putting their hand up, even in a situation where it looks like it's absolutely desolate and they'd have no chance of success?
Go for it. If you have a care about the community in which you live, and you care about the future of the community in which you live, and you care about the fundamental principles of the liberal ideal, the rule of law, the right to property, the belief in the democratic principle, the notion that you believe in personal responsibility, that reward for effort is actually a legitimate thing, then become involved and get yourself involved. Even if it looks hopeless at this stage, there are political cycles. They come and they go. And, retired crusty old politicians like me, I ended up serving 16 years, 19 if you include the gap between the two sets of 2 terms that I was an advisor. You have a real influence on the community in which you live. There were a number of programs I was involved with as a minister that I was profoundly proud of, particularly in the corrections environment, in which we knew were changing lives and we were seeing real results, and we were pretty wild and experimental. But nevertheless, they worked, and those people who were involved still contact me from time to time saying, geez, we wish you were still here, John, because you were doing something that made our work valuable for us.
And what's next then? So politics is finished?
Well, I was just about to say, when's the comeback?
Look, I suspect that I'll leave that to the younger folks. I am focused on the law firm of which I am a partner in Alice Springs. So I practice law. I also look after the Sata Fresh product. Quick plug for Sata Fresh at a Coles supermarket near you. I manage that product on behalf of the South Australian dairy farmers. I also lecture labour economics at the Indian Institute of Management at Rohtak in India, which is just outside of New Delhi. I also run the Sabre Foundation, which is a foundation that assists the victims of children's sexual abuse recover losses they've suffered at the hands of their perpetrators. And I have a number of other irons in a number of other fires. So I'm far too distracted.
Yeah, you're a busy man.
No. Well, with that in mind, we really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy calendar to come and speak to us here. And it's great to hear from Conservatives that have been to the highest levels of office within our country and different parts of our country. And, just to shed that message that there's always opportunities across the corner. Stay true to your Conservative values, but above all, be a good person, be a decent person, and just remember who you are working for. I think it's a really good, strong message you've sent today.
Look, I love the community in which I live. I get to see and have seen around the world, and I think that the Australian system of government is one of the highest forms of government that we can have. For all of its shortcomings, it is still provided the world with an example of an exemplary nation, and it's largely through the processes of a liberal democracy that we've achieved that. I would suggest to many people out there that if you look at Labor governments, particularly the one here in South Australia, in truth, they're just liberal light. But the fact is that if given the chance, they will still try and drift off to the left. But they full well know that they have to present themselves in that fashion if they want to be electorally successful, and I take great comfort from that at least.
Yeah. No, it's well said. I think we spoke about it before. Malinowskis, he probably in the last election against Marshall, at least in social issues, was portraying himself much more conservative than Marshall was.
I think he is more conservative than what Marshall is.
But if you look at he's no Don Dunstan, but he's very much a Jay Weatherill, and even Jay Weatherill was very much. Look, I used to have these conversations with a good friend of mine, John Rao, who was the former Attorney General here under Weatherill. So he's a Labor man. And I remember sitting at breakfast with him one day, and one of us looked across the table at the other and said, one of us is in the wrong party, because there was so much
stuff in common.
there was so much in common.
Yeah.
But he's introduced me to Malinauskas one day when I was still the Attorney General, and he said, this is the guy that makes the Labor Party electable. And I think that that's true.
Yeah.
Once you remove somebody like Malinauskas and you see some of the other operators in the sphere, the sock archers, who no doubt is a decent guy, but he's from the far left of the Labor Party. I think that if it was just the sock archers, they'd be a whole lot less electorally palatable.
Yeah, agreed. No, very much agreed. John, thanks for coming on the podcast.
No,
Yeah,
thanks.
thank you.
Thanks.